Hello everybody, recording live from somewhere. This is Zach Couples with episode number 49 of the Movement Debrief. And tonight's debrief, folks, it's gonna be dope as all types of hell, fam. What we're gonna talk about tonight is, when should you breathe during exercise? Should I breathe in this time? Should I breathe out that time? I'll let you know. We're going to talk about femoral anteversion and probably a little bit of retroversion as well. What do you do if you got a little bit of twist and turn in that femur? And last but not least, we're going to talk about the hierarchy. What test do I prioritize first? Then where do I go? And what about after that? Where do I go next? Stay tuned. I'll answer all those questions that were asked from the people, answered for the people, by this people, fam recognize fam. Before I dive in, quick housekeeping. Guys, if you are available September 15th and 16th in Seattle, Washington, or Kansas City, Kansas, October 27th and 28th, stay tuned for details. Or in Portland, Oregon, November 10th and 11th, the Human Matrix is coming your way. That's what's going on. Please go hit me up. There's some sign-ups. They'll be in the show notes. I hope to see you all there. Let the fam grow for a show. Otherwise, let's debrief, shall we? Oh, Chris, don't put a little pressure on me on this one, all right? But we'll see what I can do. First question comes from Dana, my mentee. In fact, she is officially the lead mentee fambro. How about that? Here's what she asked. Dana asked, when should I inhale and exhale during exercises? Dana, this is a great question. I actually had to look some stuff up on this one because I was like, no, I never thought about that. And at least with resisted exercises. But I looked up a little post by Lyle McDonald. He's a pretty smart cat. You guys should check him out. I'll link the post in the show notes. And he kind of inspired a little bit of this answer. But basically, what we do is during the eccentric phase of things, and this would be not a max effort. I'll get into that. But let's say just normal movements, you know, whatever. You're doing some 8, 12 reps. I don't care. Eccentric phase of things are typically associated with inhales. Concentric phase of things typically associated with exhales. Why is this? I'm glad you asked. When I exhale, typically I get more of a concentric action in some of the abdominal muscles. Uses a little bit more force as I do that. So when I'm doing a concentric action and I want tension created in the muscles or a contraction, seems to make sense to associate that with an exhalation. When I inhale, I don't get that same tension in the abdominal region as an example. So it would make sense, since there's an eccentric action in the thoraco-abdominal pelvic region, how about that one? Since there is a little bit more of an eccentric action in that area, it would make sense that I would inhale more so on the eccentric. That's typically what is coached. So when things stretch, I can enhance a stretch. Let's say I want my upper back to stretch as I reach with an inhale. I know I kind of cheated that a little bit. Let's do that again. That's probably a little bit better. Or when I do a shift into my hip, I take a nice inhale to enhance that stretching effect. And then when I want to create a little bit more tension, you throw in an exhale. We see this in a lot of different styles of training just besides your typical resistance training. In hardstyle kettlebells, for example, anytime they perform the concentric action of the move, they do that forceful exhale to generate tension in the abdominals because that's what exhalation is associated with, tension generation. Another interesting tidbit. Let's say I'm doing something where there's axial loading involved. Say a back squat, front squat, any type of squat, any type of deadlift. When I take a breath of air in, assuming I have good variability and I got good mechanics, the descension of the diaphragm should increase intra-abdominal and intrathoracic pressure. This pressure helps maintain stability and safeness in the spinal column. Now, if I got some wheels on my back and I'm going to dip down into a squat, I probably want that. So from an axial loading standpoint, it would make sense to be able to create a little bit more pressure in the thoraco-abdominal pelvic region So I keep those structures safe as I'm moving weight. Another reason why you want to inhale when you're doing some type of eccentric action. Now, there are certain cases that you probably would want to do a breath hold or a Valsalva maneuver. Basically what that is, Valsalva maneuver, you take a breath of air in, you hold your breath, close the glottis. What that does is that helps keep intrathoracic pressure up to snuff. Because if you're letting air out, you're going to lose intrathoracic pressure. And ideally what we're looking for when we're doing any type of loaded movement or where we're holding our breath is we'd like to have a maintenance between intrathoracic and intra-abdominal pressure, almost like an even split between the two. So a max effort squat or a very heavy squat, very heavy anything axial loading, or really anything where you're loading pretty heavy, Valsalva might be warranted to keep the thoraco-abdominal pelvic region stable as you press, whether it's your upper body or your lower body. So that's when I would incorporate something like that, because we need pressure to be able to move maximal weight and to keep the contents of this region safe. So to summarize, when you breathe in, eccentric action. When you breathe out, concentric action, because concentric, tension, exhalation, all go along the same path. If you're doing something heavy, take a breath of air in to get pressure going. Lock it off with the Valsalva because that closes the glottis, and you ought to be in business with your breathing and lifting. Dana, phenomenal question. Athlete, since you called me coach. Next question comes from Jordan. Hey buddy, I had a question. Looking for some helpful tips for one with femoral anteversion and subsequent glute med irritation, strain, or resources to help with exercise applications. That's a great question, Jordan. Vital Performance, appreciate you. So Jordan, let's first talk about what is femoral anteversion, because I'm sure you're all probably wondering, hey, I've never heard of that, or maybe you have heard of that, you just want a little refresher. So when we're talking about anteversion, or its opposite, retroversion, what we're talking about is the twist, the relative twist in relation to the femoral neck and the body of the femur. So if I'm anteverted, what that means is that twist is pushing the femur a bit more forward or anteriorly. This is going to, if we haven't had any compensatory actions down low, this is going to make someone relatively pigeon-toed. And this is a structural adaptation that happens. When you test these people, they're going to have a crazy amount of internal rotation at the hip, not so much external rotation. On the flip side, retroversion, that twist has made the femur relatively posterior. It's created a posterior twist. What's going to happen, again, assuming that there's no compensatory activity down low, is the foot's going to be a little bit more toed out. Wah, wah, duck feet. That's going to clinically show crazy amounts of external rotation, minimal internal rotation. That's anteversion, that's retroversion. How do you test for this? There's not really super good tests. The one test that's clinical that I've seen, and I used to use quite a bit, is the Craig's test. I'll link it in the show notes. But basically what you do with the Craig's test is your individual is prone, you flex the knee, you're going to put your hand on the greater trochanter, so the outside of the hip, and basically you're going to kind of rock back and forth with the femur, or with the leg, until the trochanter is approximately in like a neutral position or facing directly out. And you would measure the degree of rotation in which the hip is in. I believe if the femur is IR'd past 15 degrees, don't quote me on that, but if it's IR'd past 15 degrees, then what happens is you would classify that individual as anteverted. And I think if it's like way into external rotation, I don't think there's a specific number. You might say that individual is retroverted. That would kind of be what anteversion, retroversion is. Now, how often are you going to see this? And I think the answer, especially considering that with the Craig's test, when they compared it to imaging, it was like comparable. But the problem is, like, the imaging wasn't that good either in terms of classifying when someone's anteverted or retroverted. But to me, I don't know how often this is prevalent. I would question that it's probably not as prevalent, or at least a clinically meaningful anteversion or retroversion as you would think. And the reason why I say that is because a lot of times we are not accounting for proximal orientation of this bad boy that is the innominate, or even other things upstairs that can influence hip range of motion when we're looking at someone who's performing these types of tests. Because what may happen is maybe they do have a degree of anteversion. But when you adjust this, and not adjust, but you know what I mean, do something that influences the position of the pelvis, you might actually get an appreciable amount of external rotation back. Well, fam, that's good in my book. Do we care about the anteversion? No. So how do you know when you got that cleared away? You have your frontal plane measures normalized, you got sagittal plane measures normalized, and you chase external rotation in a safe manner that you're not achieving any undesirable effects. So if I got a cat who we thought was retroverted, and they've cleaned up all these tests, and you try to do IR stretching, and maybe you're not getting that backside of the hip stretch the way you'd like, hey, maybe that person's retroverted. Maybe. Same thing, if I have someone who's anteverted and I'm trying to chase after external rotation, and maybe I'm not getting that groin stretch that we want to get with IR, or I'm not getting the inferior glute max stretch, but I'm getting something else funky, like some type of pinching, after I've cleared all the other measures, then maybe we're onto something. Maybe that's when you check your Craig's test and say, okay, yeah, this person might be anteverted or retroverted. But I do think that the incidence is really rare. And I know that there's a lot of people on the interwebs who say, oh, well, you know, you probably got a retroverted hip, you probably should squat this way, anteverted. I don't think you can say that until you've cleared that stuff. And really, I don't think we can confidently say that, period, with the testing that we have available. That's just my thoughts. Now, what do you do if you have someone who's got like a strain and maybe they have crazy amounts of rotation into external or internal? What do you do to make that move better? In my opinion, you would do activities, or treat your test first and foremost, which we'll talk about later, but restore variability. If there's a particular motion that's painful, see if you can change the context of the motion and see if that makes an impact. For example, maybe you have someone who's got pain with internal rotation and it reproduces that gluteus medius kind of jazz that you were talking about. Well, maybe if you shift their hip back or you shift their hip forward and you try the same IR, that might make a difference. Then you're retraining the motion that's painful. That's going to potentially reduce threat because brain thinks, oh, no, I can do that IR kind of thing right now. Maybe that's not so bad. Maybe this doesn't have to hurt. Do something like that. And actually, if you check out my impingement post or debrief that I did last week, which, by the way, if you didn't check that out, I made a boo-boo. Thank you, Sebastian, for pointing this out. But I flip-flopped the cam and pincer impingement. Cam is actually femur. Pincer is actually acetabulum. My fault, Sebastian. Thank you for being fan and correcting me on that. But looking at that and that type of protocol that I talked about before, probably very applicable with someone who you think might be anteverted or retroverted. But I do think the incidence of that is incredibly rare. I think in the past, let's say in the past year, yeah, let's go past year, I think I've seen, I check a lot of hips. In fact, I check just hips on just about everyone that I work with. I think I've seen one person who I could say, this guy's probably retroverted, and I don't think I can say that I've seen anyone who I think is anteverted. But I think if you see someone who has one of those adaptations and they're significant enough that it's going to impact your decision making, they might also have an associated osteoarthritis. And I haven't read this study, so I don't want to say that this claim is true. But I was just glancing over something real quick when I was trying to prep for this. And they were saying that it was either retroversion or anteversion. I'll link it in the show notes. hip test or hip paper, but that the amount of either anteversion or retroversion was associated more with hip osteoarthritis. So if you're seeing someone who has these gross structural adaptations, that's probably going to impact loading in a negative fashion, and they might have to have some type of surgical procedure down the line. I just don't know. This guy, I mean, this guy was unbelievable. He was retroverted, whatever. He also probably had crazy hip OA. But he had to get up. When he stood up from something, he had to cross his legs. Like, literally cross his legs and stand up like that. So, or cross his feet, I should say, in order to stand up, because he had so little internal rotation. And we tried everything in my power to make a change in that, and his power too. And we couldn't change anything. I mean, there was minimal budget. I mean, maybe we were able to get him to 0. That guy probably had retroversion, but he also probably had some structural adaptations at the hip. So something to just be mindful of. So treatment-wise, again, change the context of the movement that's offending. That would be priority number 1. If you do think this person is anteverted or retroverted, the other thing I would say is you might want to be mindful of how wide their stance is in a squat or a deadlift. If I have someone who is anteverted, so that means crazy amounts of IR, limited ER, narrow the stance. A lot of good Olympic lifters or people who are fast off the gun, they typically have crazy amounts of IR, like an acceleration. They want their stance a bit more narrowed. So, Oli lifters, likely way more IR than ER. If I'm someone who's retroverted, that's more like your powerlifting style thing. Maybe you go a bit wider in your squat stance or deadlift stance when you're working with these types of individuals until you restore IR as much as that person's body allows. That would probably be the only other change that I would make for these people. So to summarize that point, anteversion, twist forward, lots of IR, limited ER, retroversion, tilt backwards, lots of ER, limited IR. You can use a Craig's test to try to check it, but before you check that, check this bad boy right here, and check everything else up here that I don't have, which would be the thorax, the lumbar spine, the rib cage, all of that, because you don't know what the rotation tells you until you have everything else cleared out up top. Then you can see if there's something local that needs to be done at the hip. Once you figure that out, if there's some painful movements, try to change the context. Shift them one direction into maybe a little bit more IR. Shift them more into ER. So shift the hip into posterior rotation, anterior rotation. Try IRing. See what happens. And in the short term, if they're anteverted, narrow stance with your stuff. If they're retroverted, or you're thinking that, go a little bit wider until you clean up the rotation. And if you do those things, you ought to be in business. Jordan, that was a great question. Last question for tonight. This comes from my boy, Rohan. Rohan asks, hey Zach, could you talk about inhibition, and in particular, the order of which you prioritize things? Why, yes, Rohan, I can. Rohan, I can. See what I did there? I used to be a rapper back in the day. So, inhibition, what is that? It's not a term I use much anymore, but inhibition would be getting things to chill. So if you have a movement that is limited in some direction, maybe you would have to, let's be very, very simple. Let's say I can't extend my hip. What might help me in extending my hip is inhibiting anterior structures, so getting them to chill. So get your hip flexors to chill, those kind of things. That would be a very gross example. I don't use that term necessarily as much as I used to, and the reason why I don't is because I don't know if we are inhibiting or facilitating things. Like when I restore hip extension, I certainly hope that the hip flexor is not off. I kind of need that when I'm doing movements. If I am trying to restore hip internal rotation, well, I certainly hope the external rotators aren't off. They're one of the best things you got to help keep the femur in the socket. So we're probably not turning things off or inhibiting or even turning the volume knob down. But what is probably a more likely scenario is you are just altering how that muscle or muscles is contracting by changing the relative position or orientation of the bones that they would move. That's what I think. Now, what do you prioritize first and foremost? This involves what I look for in my assessment and what I would treat in order to achieve some of the adaptations that we've talked about in the past from a variability standpoint. The very first thing that I'm going to look at is, with anything, I want to look at the things that have the fewest amount of compensatory actions that could occur in a given test. For example, there's a lot of things that this scapula can do. It's not, we're not even just talking about what the rib cage can do, but the closer axial we get to things, the fewer degrees of freedom are present. I can't move my rib cage in as many directions as I can my scapula and my glenoid. Definitely not my hip. So those tests, because there's more potential compensatory actions at the further appendicular joints that we go, or the further out we go appendicularly, I should say, the more room there is for possibilities. I need a test that limits the possibilities that can happen in a given area. For me, that test is the infrasternal angle. So that would be, if I got my sternum right here, I go to the rubbery portion of said sternum, and I'm outlining the ribcage angle using the xiphoid process as my midpoint. That's how I'm looking today. A little higher on the right, but I'd say overall not bad. So I look at that first, because there's fewer things that can happen in that area. I'm either wide, I'm narrow, or I'm asymmetrical. That's it. Or you know, my rock solid 90 that I shoot for. So that's my highest priority, because if I can change that in a favorable direction, so if someone's wide, I make them a little bit more narrow. If someone's narrow, I make them a little bit more wide. If someone's asymmetrical, I try to make them a little bit more symmetrical. If I can do that, because this impacts stuff up here in the rib cage, and it impacts stuff down low, lumbar spine, think of the systemic effect that I can have on the body. So that's top priority for me. What would be next, and the second priority, would be frontal plane motions at the hip, adduction, abduction. That will give you an appreciation for sagittal, because if you can get the hip into 0 degrees of extension, you probably got a decent amount of sagittal plane. Then you can check the motions of the hip into AB and AD, because that helps me appreciate what this angle right here, the infrapubic angle, is doing. So if I got someone who's got this limited without compensatory actions, and this is where it gets funky, because I'm using an appendicular test to approximate the axial. And when I use appendicular tests, there's potential for greater compensatory actions. I'll link a few things that talk about this, and I'll link some of the infrasternal angle stuff. Let's link ISA, and let's link IPA. But if I'm measuring adduction, that measures how well I can close this outlet. Or how, actually, I'm sorry, I misspoke, how well I can open this pelvic outlet. Because me doing this is the same thing as me doing this, moving the outlet apart. The other option, abduction. That requires me closing the outlet to be able to abduct the femur. That would be test number 2. So we got something that looks at rib cage, and I got something that looks at pelvis. From there, it's kind of a crapshoot. There's a cluster of tests that I look at and try to elicit changes. I would say the next important ones for me would be shoulder stuff. So I look at external rotation, internal rotation, horizontal abduction. Those are my big 3. And I try to restore all of those next. Because what those are proxy measures for what's going on in the thorax and the scapula. For example, if I can't externally rotate, there's probably something going on the front side that's limiting me. If I can breathe in, I should say, or wait, did I misspeak? No, I did not. Yeah, there's probably something on the front side that I can't do. Now, I did misspeak. Hang on one second. If I can't externally rotate, what may happen is I do not have a good thorax scapular relationship on the back side. So what I associate that with is external rotation is a proxy measure for how well can I fill up the scap. Because if I can't do that and I end up having to retract because I got all this open space along the back side, that is going to pull some of the structures anteriorly a little bit more tight, toned up. No bueno. Then when you do that, or you restore something posteriorly, that helps restore the relationship of things up front, and then I can go externally rotate. IR is the reverse. Let's say I can't fill up the front part of the chest, shoulder comes a bit more forward because there's a bit more space there, then I can't IR because everything along the backside gets a little bit more toned up. Restore stuff up front, then you can IR. Simple. Horizontal abduction, that's my measure for trunk rotation, T1 to T7. So if I can't do that, then I'm going to do things that help drive the rotation or help focus on the rib cage to scapula relationship. Example, and one thing I've been using a lot, I use the pec twist a lot, especially for narrow people, to help restore that. Once I've done that and I've gotten all of my thorax measures clear, then I typically go down to hip rotation. And that would be external, internal rotation, see what I can to drive that. And a lot of times as I'm doing these things, I'm not going like, okay, I'm going to do this move to get shoulder external rotation back, and then I'm going to do this move to get shoulder or hip internal rotation back. I'm oftentimes combining moves once I've gone through that hierarchy, or combining things that that individual needs and then putting them in a position to help try to meet all of those needs simultaneously. But that's pretty much how I prioritize things when I'm working with an individual. So to summarize all of that, I don't use inhibition much because we don't turn muscles on and off. It's not a switch. It's altering how they are impacting that body that you have just worked with based on the position and the orientation that the bones are in and what their relative action is because of that. Things I prioritize, infrasternal angle because there's fewer compensatory actions there. Then I go to more appendicular measures, looking at frontal plane measures at the hip. Then I'm looking at all of my shoulder measures. Then I'm going transverse plane stuff at the hip. And if you do those things in those order, you're gonna get most of the people where they need to be from a variability standpoint. And I think that's a good stopping point for us tonight. I want to thank you guys so much for tuning in. You guys have been wonderful, beautiful, sexy, outstanding people. And you're probably wondering, Zach, you ain't half bad. Where can I find out more? Simple answer. Go to zachcouples.com. You can find just about everything you need there. While you're there, subscribe to my newsletter. You'll get access to about 3 hours of talks, 50 pages of notes, a few acute chronic workload calculator, and every Friday I'm going to send you some goodies saying, hey, check these out. I thought this stuff was cool. Hit me up there. While you're there, I offer several online services that you could be benefited from, such as online movement consultations. If you're toyed, or maybe you think you're anteverted or retroverted or something, you're like, hey man, I want you to check that stuff out. Hit me up for that. If you want to learn how to practice or utilize some of the stuff that we talked about today with your clientele, I can mentor you and help you with that. Definitely hit me up for the mentorship program. Or if you say, yo, it's Zach, screw all that stuff, I just want gains, I can help you with some online fitness training. Definitely hit me up with those things. If you want to find me other ways, if you want to say, listen to the other 48 debriefs that I've done, and you don't want to look at me, subscribe to the Zach Couples Show on iTunes or Stitcher. If you want to just check me out on social media, because I do stuff on there every once in a blue moon. Facebook.com/ZCouples. I'm on Twitter. The handle is @ZCouples. And of course, that Instagram, baby. Zach, Z-A-C, Couples, C-U-P-P-L-E-S. And then hit me up on YouTube, search for Zach Couples. You'll find everything you need. You'll find a bunch of exercises. That's where you can find out about me. I want to thank you guys so much for tuning in. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening. Keep it real, but not to the extent where things go wrong. Stay hungry, stay learning, stay moving. And I'll see you next time. Deuces.